God made the world and all its wonders for man to explore. And there are countless wonders just outside your front door. Now join natural world photographer and journalist Roger W. Downs as he shares the stories of the people, places, music, and cuisines he has discovered as we explore with RWD.
Hey, welcome on in. I'm Roger W. Downs. And back in December of 2021, I took my two boys, Brandon and Christian, down to Galaxy's Edge, which is the theme park for Star Wars, run by Disney, just outside of Orlando. I think that's in Kissimmee, if my memory serves me right. Anyways, we had a great time. But my brother, my sister, and my oldest son, Zachary, all live in Orlando. So we kind of hung out throughout the entire weekend. And the day before we went down to Galaxy's Edge, my sister said, hey, you love wildlife. How about we all go to Blue Springs State Park? And there's a bunch of manatees in there right now. Would you like to go see them? Now, I have never seen a manatee in real life before, so I was all excited about it. I'm like, sign me up. Let's go. So we all piled up into her car and drove on out there, got into the park, walked along the boardwalk, saw the manatees just kind of floating around along with the other wildlife, and I was just having a blast. And that is when I discovered a tent with a bunch of volunteers underneath it from the organization Save the Manatee Club. And they were super sweet people, educated me and my boys about how manatees interact with each other, why they're up in the springs, and all the other things manatee. And after our conversation, I started to think, maybe I should share that information with you. So I reached out to the Save the Manatee Club and asked, can I have you guys come on my podcast and talk about manatees? And they set me up with their manatee biologist, Tiare Fridrich, who goes by TJ with most of her friends. So we're going to refer to her as that throughout the rest of the podcast, if you don't mind. So what do you say we start off with a very basic question, but one that needs to be answered? TJ, what exactly is a manatee? Is it a swimming cow because they're sea cows, or is it some sort of combination between a cow and a fish, or where does it fit exactly?
So manatees are aquatic marine mammals in the order Sirenia. So Sirenia include dugongs and manatees. They're also known as sea cows. They're called sea cows because they're slow, they are large, and they eat mostly grass like cows do. But they're not related to cows. In fact, manatees are closely related to elephants and hyraxes, which is a small mammal, a land mammal. But manatees themselves, they're in their own order, Sirenia. They're called Sirenians.
Yeah, you heard her right. She said elephants. Now, I know what's going through your head right now. Swimming elephants in the ocean. Go ahead, giggle a little bit. I know I did. But elephants are actually very good swimmers. And most mammals are, except for two. Primates and us. Go figure, because in the beginning of our lives, we're just floating around in a bag of water for 9 months. You'd think we wouldn't forget how to do that. But speaking about elephants and manatees, what else do they have in common? Like maybe their trunks and snouts?
Well, manatees actually do use their mouth to grab things. They don't really use their fins to grab the grasses. They use their lips to pull things into their mouth. And manatees also have skin very similar to elephants. It's rough and bumpy and gray.
But don't get confused. Manatees aren't swimming elephants. They're just distantly related. And there's more information out there that you can research this topic on if you like. Right, TJ?
There is a manatee textbook that came out. It's not really dense like most scientific textbooks. It was actually written so that anybody who wants to learn about manatees can read it. And it talks all about that in the book. So as far as the evolution and what we know and what we don't know and things like that, it's all in there.
And the name of that book is The Florida Manatee Biology and Conservation. And don't worry, I'll put a link in the description of this podcast where you can purchase your own copy if you'd like. But since we are talking to TJ, who is a manatee biologist, let's refer to her wealth of knowledge. So TJ, where would we find manatees typically in the wild?
So manatees actually live in a variety of habitats. They live in rivers, springs, and coastal marine habitats like estuaries and bays. But they live in different habitats in different times of the year. We actually say these migrate seasonally, and that's because manatees will spend the winter around warm water sources. So springs and power plants and thermal basins, which are areas that hold on to heat, even though there's not a lot of water coming into an area, These areas provide warm water for manatees in the winter, and manatees have to stay in warm water when the water is below 68 degrees. Manatees can get cold stress, and cold stress is like hypothermia. So they'll get skin lesions and their immune system doesn't function as well, and they can lose a lot of weight. And if the syndrome goes on for too long, they need to be rescued. So manatees need to stay in warm water in order to survive the winter. So that's why we see these huge aggregations of manatees around these warm water sites, such as Blue Spring, which had the highest number of manatees counted on record this year, with over 500 animals in the spring.
That seems like a lot of manatees for one spot. Although when I went to visit, there was about 250 in the spring that day. So do manatees ever get a little ouchy? Because I got to be honest, if I was pushed in with about 250 people in my house all winter long, I guarantee there'd be some heated arguments after about 3 or 4 days.
So manatees are not territorial and they're not aggressive. The only time you'll really see manatees kind of rolling around is during mating season. But especially in the winter, their metabolism isn't that fast, and they typically just rest in the warm water areas. A lot of these warm water sites don't have food, so it's not like the manatees are fighting to get access to food. They typically just lay stacked on top of each other, and sometimes the calves will feed on the moms, but there's no real fighting or anything like that. Sometimes if a manatee is spooked, you'll see all the other manatees leave an area because they're all touching each other. But there really is no aggression or territoriality in the area. And a lot of manatees, they do socialize. They will make noises to one another. They'll squeak, they'll roll around. But I wouldn't say that all manatees are friends. I think that they typically just don't mind each other being in the same space because they all need to stay warm.
So think of those warm water areas that manatees flock to in the winter, like your neighborhood. There's some neighbors that you really like. And there's other neighbors that you kind of wish would just move away. Come on, there's at least one, right? Come on, be honest. But all joking aside, what happens when a manatee can't get to a warm water area during the winter? That's a real problem. Well, that's when organizations like Save the Manatee Club step in.
So Save the Manatee Club is a partner of the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership. And this is a partnership of agencies, nonprofits, aquariums, and zoos that all work together to rescue, rehabilitate, and release manatees. And they do this year round. As a partner, we help with providing funding for the program. And also we have some of our staff members are also volunteers that go out and help with the rescues. The number of rescues really depends on what's going on. Some years, for example, if red tide is really bad. Red tide is a type of harmful algal bloom on the West Coast, and it can actually cause manatees to have seizures and not be able to keep their head above water, and they need to be rescued. And in a year where we have really bad red tide, we have more rescues. And the same thing is happening in the sense of rescues with the Indian River Lagoon, where we've had this huge loss of seagrass. Now we're having a lot more rescues than we've ever had before because these manatees aren't getting enough food and need to be saved.
I know what you're thinking already. Wow, that's an amazingly heroic effort by a group of individuals to save manatees. And it is. We should applaud them for their efforts. But what goes into saving a manatee that's in distress? Well, TJ is going to break that down for us from the minute they are able to capture the animal to save it to when they release it and where and when.
Don't wander off now. Explore with RWD will be right back after this.
Hey, it's Roger W. Downs again, and in my continued effort to share the natural world with you and God's artistry, I also take photos of landscapes, wildlife, cultures, and I share all of those on my website, rogerwdownsphotography.com. Don't worry, I'll put it in the description of this podcast so you can find it, but you'll find all sorts of varieties of God's artistry right there for you to look at. Again, rogerwdownsphotography.com, or just find the link in the description of this podcast.
Welcome back to Explore with RWD.
Again, our guest today is manatee biologist Tiare Fridrich from the Save the Manatee Club in Central Florida. But when things get bad for a manatee out in the ocean, Tiare, What are the processes that go into effect to save it?
So the first thing is members of the public typically will call the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's hotline number, which is 888-404-3922. And they'll call that number to report that they've seen a sick or injured manatee, or even a manatee that's been orphaned, which is a small calf that hasn't been seen with its mom for a while. And then the biologists at the FWC will send out staff members to go find the manatee and see what they find. Some things the animals are getting rescued for is swimming on their side. We've seen a lot of manatees that their buoyancy, which is their ability to stay in the water column or stay up, has been, they've had some problems with that. So they're swimming, they can't swim in a straight line, or they have trouble going underwater. And that's a sign that a manatee might be dealing with some issues with not getting enough food, or possibly even a boat strike, because when an animal gets hit by a boat, sometimes they can puncture a lung and then they turn to one side because they don't have air where they're supposed to. So members of the public will call in anything they see. The FWC will send out biologists to assess the animal. And if they think the animal needs to be rescued, then it will depend on what area of the state it's in, and who they're going to send. But they'll send members from the state, from zoos and aquariums, from nonprofits, anyone who's been trained to rescue an animal. And if the animal is in the water and needs to be rescued, they'll go out on a rescue boat, and working as a team, they'll put out a net and they'll capture the animal in a net and pull it onto the boat. And then they put the animal in a transport truck, and they'll transport it to whatever critical care facility it needs to go to in order to get the medical care that it needs.
And as a side note, it certainly takes a team of some well-strapped individuals to pull a manatee from the water, because they weigh anywhere between 1,000 to 3,500 pounds. But now the question's probably running through your mind is, how long does a manatee have to be in rehab before it's released back into the wild?
But it's typically a long process depending on what the animal was rescued for, especially these animals that have been struggling with starvation on the East Coast. It can take a really long time for them to gain the weight back and not be sick. So it really depends. And sometimes the animals will go to critical care, which is where they first go when they're really not doing well. And then if they need long-term rehabilitation, they'll be sent to another zoo. And that's where they'll stay for a year or however long they have to stay before they're released. And then they'll be released in a nearby area to where they were rescued from, because manatees on the West Coast and the East Coast tend to stay separate. So we wouldn't want to rescue an animal in Tampa and then release it in Miami, because that's not where the animal grew up and knows where to go.
So when a manatee is starving and malnourished, what do you have to feed it to get it back up on its flippers, if you will?
So manatees are generalist herbivores. They eat over 60 species of aquatic plants. So those are plants that grow in the water, but their favorite food is seagrass, and it makes up most of their diet.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, TJ, but I thought that the manatee's food supply was in danger.
Manatees all over the state are not threatened with loss of food. It's specifically in the Indian River Lagoon, which is a grouping of 3 lagoons on the East Coast. It's 156 miles long, and it has lost over 50% of its seagrass since 2011. Over 45,000 acres of seagrass has been lost in the Indian River Lagoon. And there's a huge manatee population on the East Coast that uses the power plant and the warm water canals in that area to overwinter. So these animals are going there in the winter, and they have to choose between staying cold and finding food to start. So when they're hungry enough, they'll leave these warm water sites and brave the cold water, and they're not finding any food, and they're slowly starving. So the reason the Indian River Lagoon has lost so much seagrass is because of harmful algal blooms. And that is when algae in the water grows out of control, typically because of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, which we can find in fertilizers. So these nutrients wash into the lagoon, and the algae, which typically doesn't have enough food to grow in crazy amounts, will grow completely out of control. And it blocks all of the light to the plants in the water. And then when it dies, it either goes to the bottom and smothers everything, or when it dies, it uses all of the oxygen. The process of decomposition uses all the oxygen in the water, and all of the fish and other animals die. So that's why we see these huge fish kills in areas where there's algal blooms, because there's just no oxygen in the water. And this has been happening year after year after year in the lagoon, to the point where the seagrass just isn't able to grow back before the next bloom comes along.
Well, that is absolutely heartbreaking. So are there any efforts locally, regionally, or even nationally to help stop that from happening?
So it's not just fertilizer, it's also septic systems and wastewater treatment. And there are initiatives in place. There's been a lot of funding recently put into that area of the lagoon to repair and upgrade a lot of these septic systems. And there's also a lot of nonprofits that are working on replanting seagrass and other organisms like clams and oysters that actually filter these nutrients and other things out of the water and clear up the water quality. But it's a slow process, and it's something that should have happened years ago when we first saw the algal blooms, and not when we've lost so much seagrass that the manatees are dying. This kind of thing could happen anywhere that nutrients aren't being kept in control. It the saddest thing is that we knew that this type of thing, not necessarily the manatees, but the loss of seagrass and degradation of habitat was going to happen. And scientists have been warning for a while, but it's very difficult to get an entire community to work together to restore a habitat when nobody can really see what's wrong with it. It's really hard to tell exactly what's wrong if you don't live there, or if you haven't seen the seagrass disappear yourself. But we've known for a while that things weren't good in the lagoon.
Okay, so I have to ask, how does someone get involved in helping out? Is there a way to possibly donate funds or to volunteer to make a difference?
Absolutely. So we at Save the Manatee Club have recently been expanding our efforts on the East Coast, and we're working to partner with some of these organizations that are doing restoration on lagoons. So mangrove planting, seagrove planting, doing clam and oyster work. So that's one thing our staff is doing. We're also helping our volunteers get involved with these projects as well that are on the East Coast. We, as a partner of the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, also donate money to that. And that is one of the biggest ways that people can help. Is we really need more facilities and just those funds to help rescue all of these animals. And animals are being rescued and will continue to be rescued all winter. As long as there's cold weather, manatees on the East Coast will struggle until the seagrass is able to come back.
So now that we know what a lot of the dangers are for manatees, what is the romantic and family life of a manatee like? Because obviously, if we want to save the species, there have to be more manatees. How does that go about? For instance, do they mate for life like geese, or are they more cavalier?
So manatees don't mate for life. Their mating season is during warmer weather from April to November. And during this time, groups of males, like lots of numbers of males, will follow females around and chase them and try to be the one who gets her pregnant. And manatees have actually been seen running away from these groups of males. So I wouldn't say that it is very romantic.
Okay.
And once a manatee is pregnant, they will be pregnant for about 12 months, which is a very long time. So manatees only have one calf at a time. Occasionally they will have twins, but it's very rare. And the manatee will stay with the mom for about 2 years, and then the manatee at that time, manatees typically have calves between every 2 and 5 years. And once the manatee gets big enough that it doesn't need to feed off the mom anymore, some mothers will push the child away and say, no more, it's time to go on your own. And some we can actually see when there's big groups of animals in these aggregations in the winter, they'll just let any calf feed off of them. But that actually becomes a problem as well, because then they don't have enough food for their own calves. So it really depends on the manatee. Every manatee has their own personality and their own way of going about the world and what they're willing to tolerate. But just like humans, I'd say.
I think that's pretty accurate, because growing up, I know I had friends whose moms would be like, come on in, have dinner with us. No, you don't have to go home. We got plenty for everybody. And then there was moms who were like, I think that's your mom calling, Roger. Why don't you head on home?
So one thing I find very interesting about manatees is that manatee mothers will park, that's what we call it. They park their babies in areas where it's quiet, or say like mangroves, where there's not a lot of wave action, not a lot of predators, and they'll leave their calves there, and then they'll go feed. And multiple mothers will leave their calves together in an area. So they're not necessarily raising them together, but mothers and their calves sometimes will stick together in that sense. So they'll share calves. Sometimes calves will feed off of multiple mothers, and you can see mother calves swimming around, mother manatees swimming around with multiple calves sometimes, and they're not all hers. So I just think that that's a very interesting thing. But then males typically are loners until it's time to mate. They kind of go off and do their own thing.
So I got a question. If it takes a year for a calf to be born and then another 2 years to wean it, how long do manatees live for?
So manatees can live over 50 years, and it really just depends on the animal. The biggest issue for manatees is boat strikes. We don't really know how long they could live in the wild because most of them don't make it that long. The oldest a manatee has ever gotten in captivity is actually 69 years old. His name was Snooty. He is one of the oldest manatees in the world.
Wow, that's old even for a human. So I understand how boat strikes obviously are a major danger and take out a majority of manatees, which breaks my heart. But you mentioned earlier about natural predators. What is preying on a manatee? I think the smallest one is 1,000 pounds.
Really, the only thing that would go after a manatee is an alligator or, say, an invasive crocodile. They typically don't interact. Typically, if you find a manatee in an area, you won't really find an alligator nearby. But we have video and pictures of manatees almost harassing alligators and grabbing onto them. And we've seen alligators take a bite of a manatee, but they are big, and that's not something that typically happens. Typically, manatees don't have predators other than humans and our behavior.
So TJ, with the title of Manatee Biologist, I'm sure that probably drums up a lot of questions. People asking crazy things about manatees where you're probably like, what? What are the 3 biggest misconceptions about manatees that you've heard?
So one of the top misconceptions for manatees is that it's okay to give them food and water. And it is not. It is against the law to feed or water a manatee. And the reason for that is it's underneath the category of harassment, and harassment is anything that changes a manatee's behavior. So touching manatees, disturbing them, separating a mother and calf when you're swimming, or feeding and watering manatees is all against the law. And the reason that feeding and watering manatees isn't good for them is because it can attract manatees to an area that they're not supposed to be, or make them comfortable with going up to boats. So, for example, if a community is feeding an animal and cold weather comes, if the animal decides to stay instead of leaving because there's food there, now they're more susceptible to getting cold stress because they missed their window of being able to move. And we don't want manatees to associate people with food either, because they're supposed to be able to go out in the wild and find food themselves. Another misconception is that manatees can't hear boats, and that's why they get hit. Manatees have very good hearing, and they can hear boats. The issue is that when a manatee is resting, a lot of the times they're in a shallow area, and if a boat is moving fast enough, by the time the manatee hears the boat and tries to move out of the way, they can't get into that deeper water and they get hit. Or the water might not be deep at all and they can't get out of the way even if they wanted to. But manatees do hear boats, and we actually have seen in areas that have a lot of human activity, a lot of boats, manatees change their behavior to feed more at night because they want to avoid all of those boats and all of the people. So we know that boating does impact them.
So let's say you're out in a boat and you're trying to be a responsible boater, but you still hit a manatee. What should you do?
So the first thing you'd want to do is call FWC. You will not get in trouble for hitting a manatee. Calling the FWC and letting them know so that they might prepare to rescue the animal is the best thing you can do. And also try to keep an eye on it without disturbing it. If you can still see it, stay with the animal. The FWC hotline will give you instructions on what to do. That's always the best. And sometimes the manatee will swim off before you can report it, but it's always important to make the call because we'll know, say you hit an animal and you're in a bay area, we'll know to keep an eye out, or let some of our other people know who are rescuers to keep an eye out for the animal. And that happens where we'll get told there's an animal that needs to be rescued and it'll have moved and there'll be people who are tracking where it's going before we can get out and rescue it. So the third misconception that I've been hearing a lot recently is that the reason that the seagrass is disappearing is because manatees are eating it all. And that's just not true. Manatees have evolved over millions of years alongside seagrass, and they actually positively impact the seagrass community by allowing species competition and things like that. They are a part of the ecosystem. So they haven't eaten all the seagrass. I mean, just imagine that 45,000 acres of seagrass all gone because manatees ate it. I mean, how many years have we had manatees and that's never been the cause? We know that it's the algal blooms killing off all the seagrass. It is not the manatees.
Sadly, even with the facts laid right out in front of people, they'll refuse to believe it. If we've learned anything over the last 2 years, it's that fact for sure. But staying on topic and trying to be polite and friendly here. So are manatees only indigenous to Florida, or do they migrate? Do you find them in other places around the country or even around the world?
Manatees, especially in winter, are only found in Florida. But when the temperatures start to warm up, manatees actually will leave the state and go. The West Coast animals will actually go towards Texas, and the East Coast animals sometimes go as far up as Massachusetts. I mean, they'll go all the way up there. There's actually 3 different species of manatees in the world. We have the Amazonian manatee, the West Indian manatee, which is actually the main species of manatee that Florida manatees are. Florida manatees are a subspecies of the West Indian manatee. And we have West African manatees. In some areas, it's actually not known how many there even are. And these animals are still being hunted for food in some parts of the world as well.
Well, I'm happy to hear that they're protected here in the United States at least. But last I heard, they were on the threatened list and no longer on the endangered species list. But apparently there's some debate about that. Can you shed some light on that for us?
So manatees were actually downlisted from endangered to threatened in 2017. Endangered means that they're very likely to disappear in the near future. And threatened means that there's less of a threat, but they are still struggling. And we actually at Save the Manatee Club feel that it was preemptive to downlist them. The reason manatees were listed as endangered in the first place years and years ago was because of the threats that they face. So boat strikes, loss of habitat, harassment. And since then, since the 1970s, there hasn't really been a decrease in any of those threats. In fact, they're more threatened than they've ever been, but the manatees were still downlisted. And we really think that that was just a very poor decision.
All right, I have to ask, why did they go from endangered to threatened then? Did the manatee population grow? Was there some other factor where they said, maybe not endangered, more like threatened?
Well, that's a big one is, yes, we have seen an increase in the number of animals. When the manatee was originally listed, there were around 1,000 animals. And now in 2015, there was an estimate done saying that there are around 8,000 in the state, which of course we lost 1,000 of them just in 2021. But one of the big reasons that manatees were downlisted is because there are groups out there who feel like they don't need to be listed as endangered, or they really just don't like manatees because there's a lot of laws in place to protect them, especially the boating community. They don't always like manatees. And there was actually, these groups actually threatened to sue the government for not going ahead and reevaluating their status. And that's really what pushed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do a review and decide that they needed to be downlisted.
Well, once again, politics raises its ugly head. Just breaks my heart. Sometimes you'd think people would use their brains and not their egos, but doesn't seem to be the case anymore. But my son, who's 11 years old, had an intriguing question about manatees, TJ, and we're going to get to that next.
Don't go too far. Explore with RWD. We'll be right back.
Hey, Roger W. Downs here again. And as we start to get a control on COVID, well, at least hopefully, knock on wood, but maybe it's time to start living again. And what better way to do it than going on the adventure of a lifetime, Go on vacay. Get away. And I'm going to tell you who you need to contact to do that for you. Stevenson Travel Adventures. That's StevensonTravelAdventures.com. Or call right now and book your trip anywhere in the world with special rates. The number 704-284-9479.
That wasn't too bad now, was it? Welcome back to Explore with RWD.
Hey, thanks for continuing to listen. I do appreciate you. Again, I'm Roger W. Downs, your host. And our guest today from the Save the Manatee Club in Central Florida is manatee biologist Tiare Fridrich. Now, Tiare, my son, Christian, who's 11, had a very interesting question about manatees. Christian?
If manatees are called sea cows, can you milk them?
Well, manatees, I want to start off by saying manatees are not related to cows, and their mammary glands aren't exactly the same. But manatees don't make that much milk. They really only make enough for the needs of their calf. So I don't even know physiologically if you could milk a manatee. But
It's okay
that
to
is an
laugh.
interesting question.
It's okay
It's a
to
good
laugh.
question.
It is, but when he asked me that, I just started laughing because I picked him up from school and he knew I was going to talk to you. And he said, well, I got a question. I said, sure, what is it? And he said, can you milk a sea cow? And I'm like, I don't know.
You know, there are a lot of animals that we could milk that we don't. And I think the question is not can you, but should you? And the answer to that is no. No.
Don't feel bad, TJ. That question took me off guard as well. But I did want to ask, I've heard stories about when people were swimming in the springs or maybe even out in the ocean, and a manatee has literally come up and kind of eyed them up one side and down the other. Should they be worried about that, or are they just really super curious about people?
So manatees are known for being very curious and gentle. Most people, when they go swimming with manatees, they go swimming in Crystal River. And it's hard to say how much the swimming industry there might have changed their behavior. We have manatees there that are used to people, but then manatees in other areas of the state are very skittish of humans. And that's really what we want, is we don't really want manatees interacting with humans because it makes them more likely to get struck by boats. But manatees in general are very curious, very intelligent, and they will go up to people and check them out and then leave. It's very common.
So it's okay when they do that. They're just being friendly?
We don't want to anthropomorphize wild animals in the sense that are they friendly or not. Manatees don't have an aggressive nature, but they are very large wild animals. And you should keep your distance even when you're in the water swimming with them, because we don't want to disturb them. And for a giant animal like this to feed and move around, everything they do requires energy. And we don't want to be changing their behavior by, say, startling them, and then they have to use all that energy to go find food somewhere else, or say we startle them by a warm water spring and then they leave to get away from us. Manatees are considered gentle giants, but at the end of the day, they are wild, and we want to keep them that way. So just to consider when you're out there thinking about swimming with animals, that they are wild.
So if someone listening wanted to get involved in helping to save the manatees, is there a way for them to volunteer?
Save the Manatee Club has a volunteer program where we actually will train people to give talks on manatees. And that is one way that people could get involved, especially if they're out of state and they want to learn more about manatees. We also have a manatee sighting form. It's on our website. And if, say, you're in Florida and you see a manatee in your canal, a healthy manatee, you can report the sighting, and that gives us more information about where manatees are in the state. The state does do surveys and looks for manatees, but in between that time, there's a lot of knowledge we can gather just by having members of the public fill out our form. If you see a sick or injured manatee, we always recommend that you call the FWC and let them know so that they can talk about rescuing that animal. Another way people can get involved is volunteering with these other organizations all over the state that are doing beach cleanups or plantings or water quality testing, anything that helps the environment, because the environment is important for manatees. Save the Manatee Club also has an observer program at some of the springs where people will be trained and go out and look for manatees and educate the public on what best manatee practices are, such as keeping your distance when you see one and things like that. Another way that people can help manatees is by practicing manatee safe boating. We always recommend when you go out boating that you wear polarized glasses, because polarized glasses are the best way to see manatees when you're out on the water. Also, always have a spotter and be aware of what the local laws are as far as manatee zones. A manatee zone is an area where the speed is reduced because manatees tend to hang out there. And manatees are more likely to be able to get out of the way of your boat if your boat is going slow, which is why they're put in place. It's to keep boaters and manatees alike safe.
So where do people go online, TJ, to get involved with Save the Manatee Club?
So if you want to get involved with us, you can go to our website, savethemanatee.org. And we have a contact form, a volunteer sign-up form. Another great resource actually is our webcams. We have underwater webcams at Homosassa Springs Wildlife State Park and at Blue Springs State Park. And you can find that on our website as well, or at Manatee TV. And during the winter months when the manatees aggregate there, they're live streaming all the time. And you can watch the manatees come into the spring or go underwater and just spend more time looking at these amazing animals.
And those cameras are so cool. And don't worry, I'll put links to all of these websites in the description of this podcast, but go check out the cameras. I've probably watched them more hours than I should have. It's really cool to watch the manatees swim by, or better yet, when they swim up and I'm like, hello, manatees. Like I'm waving at the manatee like it can see me. I'm such a kid at heart. And finally, if I haven't said it already, thank you so much for your time, Tiare. We really appreciate you and informing us about manatees and how we can get involved in helping to save them, especially with the huge loss that you had in 2021. And with that said, this wraps up this podcast of Explore with RWD. Again, I'm Roger W. Downs, your host. Thank you so much for hanging out. Hopefully you learned something. And make sure to tune in next week. You never know who I'm going to talk to next. And if no one else has told you this yet today, I love you, and I know the good Lord above loves you. He has promised you that. So make sure to count your blessings. No matter what you've done, He will forgive you. All you need to do is ask. So until next time, peace, love, and coon dogs, y'all. I mean, who doesn't like a coon dog laying on the front porch? They're such cool dogs.
Thank you for listening. Visit us online at explorewithrwd.com to discover more about Roger, his photography, podcast, and adventures. Or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Explore with RWD. Remember, we didn't inherit the earth from our parents. We borrow it from our children. May God bless you and yours. Now get outside and go explore. Explore with RWD is produced by Downs Media Incorporated. All rights reserved.